The ISO on the camera was set to 400, perhaps too optimistic for the heavy, suffocating gloom of the hallway. But I didn't want the grain to compromise the clarity. Grain hides details, and my job was entirely about details. I adjusted the tripod legs, the carbon fiber clicking softly against the hardwood floor. It was the only sound in the house, a sprawling architectural relic from the late 20s situated on a hill that seemed to catch more rain than the rest of the county. The house had been cleared of the body 3 days prior. The coroner's van had come and gone, taking Margaret Vane away in a black bag, but the house refused to acknowledge her departure. It held on to the smell, a cloying, sweet mixture of lavender air freshener, dust, and that unmistakable metallic underlying scent of biological decay. It is a smell that settles in the back of your throat and tastes like copper. I checked the battery level on the grip, 90%. I had been hired by the probate attorneys to document the estate for the upcoming liquidation. Contents and condition. The email had said, "Be thorough. The heirs are contentious." I began in the foyer. The methodology of forensic photography is rhythmic, almost hypnotic. You corner the room. You take the wide shot. You step in. You take the medium shot. You find the details. You take the macro. It is a process of dissection. I moved the tripod to the base of the staircase. The banister was mahogany, thick with dust that looked like gray velvet in the ambient light filtering through the dirty transom window. I framed the shot through the viewfinder. The house looked sharper, colder. The lens stripped away the emotion and left only geometry and contrast. I pressed the shutter release. The mirror slapped up and down. The flash fired, a harsh burst of xenon that illuminated the floating dust motes for a fraction of a second before plunging the hallway back into grayness. As the capacitor on the flash whined, recharging, I lowered the camera to check the histogram on the rear LCD. The exposure was balanced. I was about to move to the living room when the air pressure in the hallway shifted. It wasn't a draft. A draft has direction. It touches one side of your face. This was a compression, a sudden density, as if the volume of the air in the room had increased while the walls remained static. I looked up from the camera. The hallway was empty. The door to the cellar was closed. The front door was locked behind me. I dismissed the sensation as the settling of an old structure, the groan of timber expanding and contracting with the humidity. I picked up the tripod and walked into the living room. This was the primary site. The rug was Persian, an intricate pattern of deep reds and blues, now marred by a large, dark stain near the armchair. The fluids had dried, stiffening the wool fibers. I didn't feel revulsion. You lose that after the first year. I felt only a clinical obligation to capture the scene correctly. I set the tripod low, aiming to capture the scale of the stain relative to chair. I focused manually. The autofocus motor often struggled with low-contrast textures like dark wool. As I turned the focus ring, watching the fibers sharpen in the viewfinder, I heard a sound from the floor above me. It was not the creak of a settling rafter. It was distinct. It was the sound of weight being transferred, a slow, deliberate compression of a floorboard, followed by a release. Then another. Footsteps, paced heavy and undeniable. They were moving from the landing towards the master bedroom. I stood up, taking my eye off the viewfinder. I held my breath, listening. The house was silent again, but the silence felt different now. It was expectant. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded flat, deadened by the heavy drapes and the overstuffed furniture. "I'm with the estate attorneys. Is someone here?" There was no answer. Of course, there was no answer. The keys were in my pocket. The alarm system had been active when I arrived. I was the only living thing inside 42 Blackwood Lane. I checked the living room windows. Locked. Painted shut, actually. I returned to the camera. I needed to finish the ground floor so I could leave. I work faster now. The kitchen, stacks of unwashed china, a calendar on the wall 3 months out of date. The dining room, a layer of dust on the table, so thick it looked like a tablecloth. I finally had to go upstairs. The master bedroom was on the list. It was where she had spent most of her final years, according to the briefing. I climbed the stairs. The carpet runner on the steps was threadbare, worn down in the center. I reached the landing. The air up here was significantly colder. It wasn't just a few degrees. It was the kind of cold that makes the joints in your fingers ache. I could see the door to the master bedroom at the end of the hall. It was ajar, pushing open into darkness. I walked down the hall, the floorboards complaining under my boots. I stopped at the doorway and pushed it open with the rubber foot of my tripod. The room was vast. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, stripped of linens. A heavy oak vanity sat against the far wall, flanked by 2 tall windows blocked by blackout curtains. The only light came from the open door behind me. I set up the tripod in the center of the room. I wanted a 360-degree panoramic sequence. I started with the bed, then the wardrobe. I turned the camera toward the vanity. The mirror on the vanity was old, the silvering desilvering at the edges, creating black spots of oxidation. It reflected the room behind me, the empty bed, the door to the hallway. I looked through the viewfinder to frame the vanity. The composition was good. The contrast between the dark wood and the silver items on the dresser, a brush, a comb, a small jewelry box, was striking. I half-pressed the shutter button to meter the light. The camera beeped, locking exposure. Then, the focus ring on the lens moved. I wasn't touching it. My hands were on the tripod collar. The lens was an L-series Canon, heavy and precise. The ultrasonic motor inside whirred briefly, hunting. It shifted the focus point from the vanity table to the reflection in the mirror. The image in the viewfinder blurred, then snapped into razor-sharp focus on the reflection of the open doorway behind me. In the reflection, the doorway was not empty. There was a shadow, not a cast shadow, but a standing obscurity, a vertical column of darkness that absorbed the scant light from the hallway. It stood just inside the frame. I pulled my head back from the camera, spinning around to look at the door with my own eyes. Nothing, just the empty hallway, the peeling wallpaper, the dust. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, wet thudding in my ears. I turned back to the camera. I looked through the viewfinder again. The focus was still locked on the mirror. The reflection was empty now, just the door frame. I checked the lens switches. It was set to 1-shot AF. It shouldn't have hunted like that. It shouldn't have changed subjects on its own. I didn't take the shot. I couldn't explain why, but I felt that capturing that image would be a violation, or worse, an invitation. I packed the gear. I didn't break down the tripod. I just collapsed the legs and threw it over my shoulder. I walked out of the room, down the stairs and out the front door. I locked the deadbolt with trembling hands. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the overgrown lawn. I didn't look back at the upstairs window as I drove away. My studio was in the city, a converted loft space with exposed brick and inadequate heating. It was 11 p.m. I had a deadline. The attorneys wanted the preliminary images by morning to attach to a filing. I sat in the dark, the glow of 2 27-inch calibrated monitors, the only illumination. I inserted the memory card into the reader. The progress bar crawled across the screen as the raw files imported. I poured a cup of coffee. It had gone cold hours ago, but I drank it anyway. The caffeine was necessary. I felt drained, a physical exhaustion that went deeper than muscle fatigue. It felt as if being in that house had siphoned something vital from my marrow. The import finished. The grid of images appeared. I began the culling process. Arrow key right. Flagged. Arrow key right. Reject. It was mechanical. The living room stain. The dusty kitchen. The stairs. I reached the photos from the master bedroom. There were only 3 before I had packed up. The bed, the wardrobe, and a test shot of the vanity I must have fired accidentally while setting up. I opened the vanity shot in the develop module. It was underexposed, dark and muddy. I dragged the exposure slider to the right. The image brightened. I zoomed in to check the sharpness. 100%. 200%. The grain was heavy, but the detail was there. I panned across the image to the mirror. I stopped. My hand froze on the mouse. The reflection in the mirror showed the doorway in the high-resolution file. Captured by a 45-megapixel sensor, the emptiness I had seen with my naked eye was populated. There was a figure. It was standing just inside the threshold. It was indistinct, translucent, like a heat shimmer on asphalt, but the outline was human. It was wearing something long, a dress or a nightgown. The hem trailed on the floorboards, but it was the face, or where the face should have been, that made my stomach turn over. It was blurred, violently blurred, as if the figure had been shaking its head back and forth at an impossible speed while the body remained perfectly still. The motion blur on the face was a smear of gray and white. I stared at the screen. The silence in my apartment was absolute. Then I heard it. Click. It came from the kitchen. It was the sound of a ceramic mug being set down on a granite counter. I live alone. I had brought my coffee cup into the office with me. I slowly took my headphones off. The air in the loft changed. It became heavy, pressurized, exactly like the hallway in the Blackwood house. The temperature dropped. I could feel the cold radiating from the open doorway of my office, rolling across the floorboards like invisible fog. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I watched the reflection in my monitor. The screen was glossy. Behind the bright image of the forensic photo, I could see the dark reflection of my own room behind me. I saw my own silhouette, and I saw something standing just behind my chair. It was tall. It smelled of lavender and copper. I closed my eyes. "What do you want?" I whispered. There was a sound right by my ear. It wasn't a voice. It was a sound of fabric rubbing against fabric, heavy silk, and then a sound that I can only describe as a wet, ragged intake of breath drawn through fluid-filled lungs. A cold hand, weightless yet freezing, brushed against my right shoulder. It wasn't an attack. It was a gesture, a guide. I opened my eyes. The cursor on my screen was moving. I wasn't touching the mouse. My hands were in my lap, clenched into fists. The cursor slid across the screen, jerky and erratic. It moved away from the terrifying face in the mirror and drifted down to the surface of the vanity table in the photograph. It circled a small, dark object half hidden under a lace doily. It circled it once, twice, then the cursor stopped. The presence behind me receded. The pressure in the room lifted instantly, leaving my ears popping. The cold dissipated. I spun around in my chair. The room was empty, but on the kitchen counter, 15 feet away, a spare camera lens I had left on the dining table was now sitting in the center of the island, standing perfectly upright. I turned back to the screen. I zoomed in on the object the cursor had circled. It was a small black notebook, a diary. It was wedged between the vanity wood and the marble top, almost invisible in the shadow. I didn't wait for morning. I couldn't. The logic of the daylight world didn't apply anymore. I was operating on a different frequency. I drove back to Blackwood Lane at 2:30 a.m. The fog had rolled in, thick and white, reducing the headlights to useless glowing orbs. I drove by memory. The house loomed out of the mist like a shipwreck. It was completely dark. I parked the car and killed the engine. The silence of the countryside was overwhelming. No crickets, no wind, just a ringing in my ears. I walked to the front door. I still had the key. The lock tumbled loudly, a gunshot in the quiet. I entered. The smell hit me harder this time. It was fresher. The copper scent was stronger, wet, and pungent. I didn't turn on the main lights. I didn't want to alert the neighbors or the police. I used my tactical flashlight. The beam cut a solid cone through the dust-choked air. I went straight to the stairs. The footsteps I had heard earlier, the phantom sounds, were gone. The house felt hell-breath, waiting. I reached the master bedroom. It was freezing. My breath plumed in the flashlight beam. I walked to the vanity. I didn't look at the mirror. I refused to look at the mirror. I shone the light on the gap between the wood and the marble top. There it was, the small black corner of a notebook. I pulled it out. It was a pocket diary, bound in faux leather. I opened it. The pages were brittle. The entries were sporadic. Doctor appointments, grocery lists. But the last entry, dated 2 days before the estimated time of death, was different. The handwriting was shaky, the pressure of the pen uneven, tearing the paper in places. He's still in the house. I told him I'm changing the will. He laughed. He gave me tea. It tastes bitter. Almonds. I'm so tired. I can't keep my eyes open. If I sleep, he wins. The locket. I put the proof in the locket. I frowned. The locket. I scanned the vanity. The silver jewelry box was there. The brush. The comb. But no locket. I remembered the photo. I pulled my phone out and brought up the cloud sync of the image I had edited an hour ago. I zoomed in. In the photo, resting on the velvet pincushion, was a silver locket. I looked at the pincushion in front of me. It was empty. Someone had been here. Between the time the coroner removed the body and the time I arrived to take photos? No, the locket was in my photo. That meant it was there this afternoon. Someone had been here tonight. After I left, a floorboard creaked downstairs. Real physical weight. The distinct sound of a heavy boot on wood. I froze. I turned off my flashlight. The darkness was absolute. I heard the footsteps moving through the foyer, then the living room, then the base of the stairs. They were slow, searching. These were not the footsteps of a ghost. These were the footsteps of a man trying to be quiet and failing. "I know you're up there," a voice called out. It was male, ragged, aged. "I saw your car." I stayed silent. I moved silently toward the closet. "You took pictures," the voice continued, closer now. "Ascending the stairs. I need the camera. Give me the card and you can go." The heir, the nephew the lawyers had mentioned, the contentious one. I slipped into the walk-in closet and left the door cracked an inch. I held my breath. The beam of a flashlight swept the bedroom. It played over the bed, the vanity. "Come on out," he grunted. He sounded drunk or desperate. He walked into the room. I could see him through the crack. He was wearing a heavy coat. He was holding a tire iron. He walked to the vanity. He was looking for the diary. He checked the gap. He cursed when he found it empty. "Where is it?" he hissed. He turned, scanning the room. The beam of his light hit the mirror. And then the room changed. The temperature plummeted so sharply that the glass in the window panes cracked with a loud pop. The man froze. He was staring into the mirror. I looked at the reflection from my angle. Behind the man, in the reflection, the gray blur was back. But it wasn't blurring anymore. It was solidifying. It was Margaret Vane. She looked exactly as she must have in life. Stern and small, but her skin was the color of wet ash, and her eyes were entirely black. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at him. The man started to shake. "No," he whispered. "You're dead." I checked. The figure in the mirror raised a hand. It pointed at the man's coat pocket. The man clapped a hand over his pocket, as if to hide something. The locket. He had it. He had come back for the diary, found the locket, and taken it. The entity in the mirror stepped forward, not into the room, but out of the reflection. It was impossible physics. A two-dimensional image becoming three-dimensional volume. She stepped out a glass frame like she was stepping through a doorway. The sound was like tearing canvas. The man screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of total cognitive collapse. He swung the tire iron. It passed harmlessly through the gray form. She reached out and placed a hand on his chest. He stopped screaming. He went rigid. His eyes rolled back into his head. He dropped the tire iron. It hit the floor with a deafening clang. Then he collapsed, folding it on himself like a marionette with cut strings. The figure stood over him for a moment. Then she turned her head. She looked at the closet. She looked at me. The black eyes were infinite. There was no malice in them, only a profound, weary acknowledgement. She pointed to the floor where the man had fallen. A silver locket had spilled from his pocket. Then she began to dissolve, not fading away like mist, but deconstructing. She turned into grain. Visual noise, like a photograph blown up too large. She separated into millions of tiny gray dots, and then the dots simply ceased to exist. The room was quiet. The cold was gone. I waited 10 minutes before I moved. My legs were numb. I stepped out of the closet. I checked the man. He had a pulse, but it was thready. He was alive, but he wasn't there anymore. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, seeing nothing. Shocked. Massive cardiac event. I picked up the locket. It was heavy. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I took the diary from my pocket. I placed the locket on top of it on the vanity. I set my tripod. My hands were steady now. A strange calm had taken over. I framed the shot. The unconscious man on the floor. The tire iron. The diary. The locket. The evidence of the crime. And the evidence of the retribution. I checked the settings. ISO 100. F/8. 1/60th of a second. I took the picture. The flash fired, sealing the truth in light. I called the police from the car. I waited for the sirens. When the detectives arrived, I handed them the memory card. I told them I had come back for equipment and found them like that. I didn't mention the mirror. I didn't mention the cold. They would find the poison in the locket. They would find the confession in the diary. They would have their case. I never went back to forensic photography. I sold the Canon R5. I do landscapes now. Deserts. Places with no walls, no mirrors, and no history. But sometimes when I'm editing late at night, and the grain in a night sky shot looks a little too clustered, a little too organized, I feel the temperature drop, and I smell lavender and copper, and I know that some pictures never stop developing.